This time we look at 6 four-cylinder motorcycles from the US of A. Now, whilst the four-cylinder motorcycle is synonymous with the Japanese industry, they were by no means the first country to produce them. With that in mind, here are 6 four-cylinder motorcycles built in the USA. Pierce Arrow. Pierce Arrow is a name more commonly associated with automobiles rather than motorcycles. Pierce's son Percy was a competitive driver of the Pierce automobiles, and in 1908 he visited Europe. Whilst in Europe he saw a Belgian-built FN four-cylinder motorcycle. He was impressed with the smoothness and general design, but thought his company could do better. Pierce unveiled their four-cylinder motorcycle in 1909, making it the first so produced in the USA. Remember, this is 2 years before Harley-Davidson had even produced a V-twin. The Pierce used the engine as a stressed member at the base, whereas the main tubes of the frame were extremely thick, and the gas tank and oil tanks were actually integrated into the frame. Improving on the FN, Pierce used a T-head, essentially side valves for the inlet and exhaust, rather than automatic inlet over exhaust as used on the FN, making the Pierce engine much more efficient and much more powerful. But like the FN, the first model used a fixed gear. However, by 1911, Pierce fitted the machine with a clutch and a twin-speed gear. Pierce advertised the bike as smooth and virtually vibrationless. Performance was of course fairly modest by modern standards because of its side valves, with less than 10 horsepower on tap, but it was still a good performer by the standards of its time, with a top speed in the region of 60 miles an hour. Unfortunately, despite the clever cost-saving manufacturing techniques employed, Pierce simply couldn't sell the motorcycle at a profit. As a result, with fewer than 500 of the 600cc motorcycles built, Pierce decided to end motorcycle production. The Militor, or Militaire. The brainchild of one Norman Sinclair, the company produced its first four-cylinder engine machine in 1914, although they advertised the bikes actually as a two-wheeled car, hence the rather bizarre stabilisers that were fitted to some early models. Sinclair and his company would go bankrupt at least 5 times, so these machines are often listed under a number of different names, including the Militaire and the Militor. The Militaire name was first used in 1912. As a Militaire, the bike was sold with conventional tiller-type handlebars, although it still had car transmission and car engine essentially, and of course shaft drive to the rear wheels. The wheels were constructed from wood. This was a common material for use in motorcar wheels at that time. Unusually, the machine used hub-centred steering, and this was mated to some very heavy-duty front forks. By 1914, the company had morphed into the Champion Car Company. It was under the Champion name that the four-cylinder inline engines first appear. But just in case you weren't confused enough, they changed the name back to the Militaire in 1915. Sinclair tried to sell the machine unsuccessfully to the American military, but that didn't stop him advertising the machine as meeting military standards, of course. The final iteration of these machines came with the Militor. By this point, Sinclair had dropped the stabilisers, and the machine looked a little bit more conventional. I say a little bit, it was still a massive 1600cc car engine, fitted with car wheels and a car gearbox, all inside a motorcycle frame. The machine was marketed very much for the sidecar use by then, but in the end, by 1922, the game was up, and the machine finally disappeared from view. By the end of production, less than 200 machines had been built total, of which under a dozen survive today. The Henderson 4. The Henderson Motorcycle Company was founded in Detroit, Michigan by William G. Henderson and his brother Thomas in 1911. In 1912, the brothers unveiled their first four-cylinder motorcycle. This used a 934cc inlet over exhaust 7 horsepower rated engine. The machine was continuously developed for a number of series, and by 1914 the Series C had its 2-speed gearbox incorporated into the rear hub. The Model F of 1916 employed cam gear drive and was the first Henderson available with a kickstart. And a year later the Model G arrived with improved lubrication and at last a proper 3-speed gearbox. The Henderson 4s were some of the fastest, most powerful bikes around at that time. But despite this, the company struggled during World War I, and the Hendersons were forced to sell their company to the Schwinn Bicycle Company in 1917, Schwinn also being the manufacturer of Excelsior motorcycles. Production was moved to the Schwinn factory in Chicago, Illinois, and the machines from that point on were marketed as Excelsior Hendersons. Well, except in Britain of course, because there was already an Excelsior company, so in the United Kingdom the bikes were marketed as American X. 1920 would see the introduction of the Model K. This was developed by a guy called Arthur Lemon, and this machine was heavier, but also much stronger and faster than it had been ever before, rated at around 18 horsepower. By 1922, power had risen again, this time as high as 28 horsepower, and it was at this point that the 100-mile-an-hour genuine potential of the machine came to the attention of police forces all across America. 1929 would see the KJ model. This was a streamlined effort with a much uprated engine, rated at some 40 horsepower. Top speed was well in excess of 100 miles an hour. But despite all the company's efforts, Schwinn himself called time on motorcycle production in 1931, wanting to concentrate the company's efforts on bicycle production. Given that the bicycles survived on for decades after this, it probably was a shrewd move, although a sad one for the lovers of great motorcycles. The Indian Ace. After having been forced to sell the Henderson name to Schwinn Bicycles, William G. Henderson continued to work at the company until 1919, when differences of opinion with the rest of the management forced him to resign his position. Later that year, with a new backer, Max Sladkin, Henderson started the Ace Motor Company. Not surprisingly, the Ace does resemble the Henderson, being an inline 4 with chain pedal drive. But wary of patent infringements, Henderson was careful to design the machine in a way that was slightly different than the Hendersons had been. Production of the Ace then began in 1920. Unfortunately, on December 11, 1922, William Henderson was killed after suffering a collision with a motor car while he was out testing the Ace sporting model. Ace would cease motorcycle production in 1924 and would blink in and out of production and existence several times during that period, until eventually in 1927 they were taken over by Indian. Indian would move production of the Ace to their main production facility at Springfield, Massachusetts. They would market the bike as the Indian Ace. However, as Indian made changes and modifications to the design, the Ace name was quietly dropped. The Indian 4, known as the 402, used a frame which was based on the 101 Scout chassis. For most of its production, the Indian 4 used an inlet over exhaust valve layout. Although briefly in 1936-37, they did switch this to an exhaust over inlet layout. This had the effect of, in theory, making the engine vaporise better, but it also made the engine run rather hot, and the rider too for that matter. So for 1939 the inlet system was returned back to its previous layout, for the comfort of all involved. The controls were the same as those found on other Indian models, so it was a left foot clutch and handlebar twist grips for the throttle and the ignition timing. These controls could be switched on either side depending on the rider specification. Indians of course are most famous when fitted with the left-hand throttle. This was said to be fitted to allow policemen to fire their gun whilst holding the throttle open during a pursuit. The very last models appeared in 1940. These had deeply valanced mudguards and swoopy styling, so it was all very Art Deco. The frame was modified and was now fitted with plunger rear suspension, so rider comfort was also greatly improved over the previous models. Also very much at the time, the bike came with 16-inch wheels rather than the previous model's 18-inch wheels, and balloon tyres. By that point, the 4 was very much seen as obsolete and rather expensive, so demand by the early 40s had really tailed off massively. Indian discontinued therefore in 1942. Cleveland Motorcycles. After a full stop between 1902 and 1905, Cleveland Motorcycles not surprisingly based in Cleveland, Ohio, began motorcycle manufacture again in 1915, initially with two-stroke singles of 221cc, unusually featuring a longitudinal crankshaft, whilst curiously retaining chain final drive. They built their first four-cylinder bike in 1925. This was a 598cc T-headed side valve. This meant that in terms of its capacity and its physical size, this was a smaller machine than the other fours built in the United States at that time. In 1926 they replaced their engine with an all-new design by E.H. DeLong. This now featured an F-head instead of a T-head and was of larger capacity, some 61 inches. By 1928 Cleveland found themselves in financial trouble, so they decided to offer themselves as an alternative to the ace-based Indians to Harley-Davidson. Harley-Davidson did seriously consider the offer, but ultimately decided to go in their own direction. In 1929, Cleveland announced their Tornado model. This had a lowered frame and seat height, lighter pistons, larger valves, and higher compression, making it much more sporty than the previous range. But unfortunately for Cleveland, 1929 was of course the year of the Wall Street crash, and as a maker of prestige four-cylinder motorcycles, Cleveland's sales were very badly affected. As a result, by 1929, was forced to call it a day. The Motus. Production of the Motus MST began in 2014 in Birmingham, Alabama. The machine used a longitudinally mounted 90-degree V4 with overhead valves and liquid cooling. This was the first V4 motorcycle produced in the United States, and in standard form produced a claimed 165 horsepower with a top speed of almost 170 miles an hour. One interesting feature is that the engine is slanted in the frame. This was done to improve weight distribution and reduce the overall length of the machine. Another interesting point was that despite its longitudinal engine, it still made use of chain final drive. To simplify production, the team cleverly used components already present in the American car industry, while other components were purchased from off-the-shelf manufacturers. Despite this, because of its small-scale production, the costs on the machine were very high, over $40,000, because the company simply couldn't achieve the economies of scale that a larger production plant would have provided them. As a result, the Motus went out of production in 2018. A sad end for what would have been a very daring and a very interesting project. Well, I do hope you enjoyed our collection of four-cylinder American motorcycles. What type of machine would you like to see a video on? Please comment below. And if you enjoyed that video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.